So tonight, our presenter is Lawrence Turner, Mendocino Land Trust Senior Land Acquisition Project Manager. For many of you, Larry needs no introduction. I asked him if he wanted to be introduced as Lawrence or Larry, because he always writes his name as Lawrence, and he explained that Lawrence is the name he uses in writing. In person, you can call him Larry. So I think tonight, Larry will work for all of us. Larry's family has been living in Fort Bragg for 6 generations. He lives in a home that was built by his grandparents, and I'm sure he'll tell you more about that. He's coming to you live from there right now. Larry started working for the Mendocino Land Trust about 2 years ago, after more than a decade working for the Mendocino Coast District Hospital. After serving on many nonprofit boards, Larry is now doing amazing work in land acquisition and project management, and we're very fortunate to have him on staff. Larry's a font of information on many topics, especially railroad history. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn the screen over to Larry.
Thank you, Amy. I appreciate that. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Glad everyone's here. I'm thrilled with the turnout. How exciting that is to see everyone's faces as they kind of scroll by over here on Zoom. I will apologize in advance for any Zoom awkward.
You're muted.
Larry, you're muted. Unmute yourself.
There we go. Got it. All right. I was just apologizing for awkwardness between the computers. So there we go. I've already hit it. So I'll call that my Zoom error. Thank you, Amy, for introducing me. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. And I was just apologizing that I've got 3 screens in front of me, so I will try my best to manage those for you. We've been rehearsing them, but this is a little bit new. This is our first time we've done this all told. So tonight we're going to talk about rails and railroads, or redwoods and rails. I am an avid railroad fan, and I have been I've grown up around the redwoods, been part of my heart and soul. So I am excited to put the two topics together. Tonight we're going to talk about a place called Crowley that's out on the California Western Railroad. It also happens to be part of the Mendocino Land Trust's Noyo River Redwoods property. And then we're also going to talk about a place called Bunker Gulch, where Mendocino Land Trust has done some restoration. It is part, or was part, of the Caspar, Southfork, and Eastern Railroad, and that'll be in the second part. If anyone has questions, Heidi's taking questions, or you can raise your hand and I will try to call on you that way too, but your best bet is to get those over to Heidi, and we can stop along the way if you've got questions. So I'll start with an introduction with myself a little bit. As Amy said, I'm 6th generation here in Fort Bragg. That picture is the family store right after the 1906 earthquake. Our old family store used to be out on Franklin Street here in Fort Bragg. It got rebuilt, and the building is still out there on Main Street where Feet First is right now. As Amy mentioned, I'm coming to you from the house that my grandparents built. The redwood that you see in my background is likely redwood that came from these redwood forests, likely on the trains that we're going to talk about tonight. I've worked in the Land Trust for about 2 years. That's me on my very first day of work at the Land Trust as I was walking in the door. And I am also, not only do I do conservation, but I am a ferroequinologist, which is a really fancy way of saying I'm a train geek. So I have a lot of fun with all of this. Some people call me a foamer. If you talk to Robert Pinoli down at the Skunk train, he'll call me foamer when I'm gawking at the trains. It's because you foam at the rail fans foam at the mouth when they see trains and they like them. I've worked in multiple forest regions down in Southern California in Cleveland National Forest, the center part of California coast at the Portola Redwood Forest, and then here locally in our forests. So where are we tonight? I know we've got people from out of state. So if you look at the left side of your screen, you're going to see the map, and I've highlighted an area over there. We're way over there in the California zone, West Coast, just so you know where we are in the northern region. And I'm going to zoom the map in a little bit so that you can see that we are right up here at the top of the map. The first place we're going to talk about is Crowley. It's inland over there over top of Willits is what that word is. And the second place is Bunker Gulch. We are about, by car, 3.5 hours from San Francisco if you're fast. So we're quite a ways away from San Francisco. A lot of people think we're very close, but we're not. But I also want to talk about the time period that we're in. So there were not freeways in a lot of these times and the period that we were looking at. Historically, the way you could travel was by steam schooner, and you'd get on either here at Fort Bragg or at Caspar, and you'd sail down the coast down to San Francisco to the Bay Area. Evidently, it was not a very pleasant passage. My great-grandmother evidently went that way a couple of times and didn't ever have anything nice to say about it. The other way to do it was by stagecoach. And this picture is from out on the Cal Western line. I'm not sure where, I believe it's at Alpine. But a couple of quotes, one from a historical text here about what a bumpy ride and how they tied a log to the back of the stagecoach in order to keep it from rolling down the hill and rolling over everything. And then from my grandmother's journal, she has the time when she got to take the train from Fort Bragg to Willits and then from Willits to San Francisco for the very first time. And the night before they left, she said, what a treat it will be to travel to the city in just a single day, no more bumpy ride. So what we do in like 3.5 hours took more than a day or a full day to get there. So technology has brought us a lot closer. So the coast was a lot further away to people during the time period we're talking about. So let's talk about logging practices that happened back turn of the century in the 1900s. This was a time of resource extraction. This is a picture of what logging looked like. They went in and they took all of the trees. So every tree that was in front of them, they took and they hauled off to the mill. That's just the way they did it. And the trees were big. So look at the size of the trees in comparison to the lumbermen that are standing there. Some of them are twice or almost 2.5 times as tall as these gentlemen that worked out in the woods. So these are, and this is a picture from here in the Mendocino area. When the trees were cut, at first they were hauled by oxen and ox teams. And this picture is kind of interesting to me. There's a couple of things going on, and hopefully you can see my mouse a little bit. I know it's a little small on the screen there. But back here in the background, kind of right in the center, is an old steam donkey. And that's what they would use. They had a big spool of cable on them. And what would happen is they would fell a tree and then they would pull it down the hill with that steam donkey and then join it onto the oxen train. The other interesting thing that is going on here is this gentleman that's kind of standing, I don't know, mid-picture, and there's a barrel over here, and that's full of water. And what he was doing was watering down these, they called them trackways, all the logs, because what would happen is as the oxen pulled the logs in, it creates friction. And when you have two pieces of wood with friction, you get fire. So they did not want the logs to catch on fire as they hauled them to the mill. So they would just haul up these buckets of water and throw them underneath these oxen trains all day long. But so you could only use oxen so long. They're only so good. You can't haul things 8 and 10 mile by oxen all the way to the mill. So as the distances became longer, that's when the railroads came into play, especially here on the North Coast. So everything kept pushing from west to east. And as that happened, and as it got longer and longer, they needed the railroads in order to get the logs back to mill and continue having inventory. This is a picture of the Caspar, Southfork, and Eastern. It's a cute little engine named Daisy up there up front, hauling these nice big butt logs right down the middle of Hare Creek into the mill. Once they finished the product, they would ship it by steam schooner because the railroads hadn't connected yet up into the North Coast. And what they would do is they would get these giant sets of finished lumber, put it on a high wire, and they would cable it down to the steam schooners. So they would fly over the ocean down to the steam schooner. And if you notice, the steam schooner was sitting pretty low there in the water. That's because they just filled the whole thing up as full as they could of wood. The interesting thing about the steam schooners is these were the same steam schooners that took the people. So when you were taking a ride from this area down to the Bay Area, you would get on that line just like lumber, and they would lower you down to the ship. and then you would take your ride down to San Francisco. So, you know, you can see there's somebody on the lap of this person here holding on, and these two gentlemen as they just got flown either up or down from the ship. I'm not sure I'd want to take either of those rides. So we weren't going to talk about the steam schooners too long. We were here to talk about Rails and Redwoods. This is a picture of all the different railroads that were here on the North Coast. And as you can see, there were railroads all the way down as far as south as Elk, and then all the way as far north as Rockport. Some of them were very short. For example, here in Westport, there was just a little 4-mile railroad, and some of them were very long. The California Western got all the way over to Willits. The Northwestern Pacific actually had a railroad that ran from Albion all the way into Boonville, which was very interesting. And there's still a lot of evidence of that railroad around today. And then this whole spidery section here in the middle is the Caspar Railroad. They had a very extensive railroad network in the center. As much as I would love to talk about all the railroads tonight, we're going to focus on 2 of them. The California Western, also known as the Skunk Train. And we're also going to talk about the Caspar, Southfork, and Eastern Railroad a little bit later. So I'm going to keep moving. I'm going to give a brief introduction of the Cal Western. They've got a very long history. They were actually started in 1881 as the Noyo and Pudding Creek Railroad, which ran down what is now McPherson Street, right down here. And that's one of the straightest streets in town because that was the railroad at the time. The modern day railroad that sits in the track bed that it's in now was started in 1885. They got to the tunnel in 1893. They stretched the railroad out to Irmoco in 1908. And then they got over the hill and into Willits in 1911. And that's just a really brief overview of the railroad and history. It's got a very, very rich history with lots of stops, lots of camps. I could talk for days about the railroad, but tonight we're going to talk about this area with all the squiggly lines, which was very mountainous. And in particular, we're going to talk about Crowley, which was a stop on the railroad. So as I was mentioning, as areas were logged, they needed to keep pushing east to get more inventory. They were literally just running out of trees. So as they logged everything off, they would build the railroad further and haul the trees back into town. There were lots and lots of logging camps along the rail line, in particular the Cal Western. And they too just kept pushing east. And the one that we're going to talk about tonight, Crowley, was here at the apex of this turn in the blue square. They were fairly far up the hill and just before the second tunnel on the railroad. So Crowley was up in the mountains. As you can see, I didn't highlight it here on the map down below, but they were up at about 1,375 feet. The top of the hill is 1,740 feet. Down below, you can see this long straight area in the map. Shake City, where they used to make shake shingles, was at about 560 feet. So there was quite a climb from the bottom of the hill up to Crowley. In order to do that, the trains couldn't just go with one engine. They had to do what was called doubling. So in most of the pictures that you see, especially in that mountainous area, you'll see 2 engines pulling up the hill and making quite a show of it as they go. So let's talk about Crowley's history just a little bit here. Crowley was named after the man who founded the camp and ran the camp. He was evidently quite entertaining to see out there. And about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, when we were not masked and we were in person, one of our fundraisers was out at Crowley Field. I will admit this whole talk is a lot better in person. So I'm looking forward to, at some point, all of you can be in person and in the train and we can all get out to Crowley Field. But I'll do my best virtually here. So anyway, this was named after the man who ran the camp. This is what the camp looked like. It consisted of cabins, a cookhouse, foreman's quarters. Sometimes they had summer tents when they had to bring more people out there. And its most unique feature, which nobody seems to have a picture of, was a tennis court. So they hauled tons and tons and tons of clay out. Crowley was an avid tennisman and built a tennis court out there in the middle of the redwoods. And there's lots and lots of stories about the tennis court. And I had to stop and think, it's like, well, why on earth would he do that? And some of the lumber bosses were competing for the best labor. So they were offering different things at the lumber camps. Crowley had this as recreation. And you have to remember, there were no cell phones, there were no telephones, there was no internet. You may or may not get a newspaper, and you may or may not be literate. So you had nothing to read or nothing to do. So this gave them a pastime. Mr. Crowley also famously, and is written, and these are not my words, these are the words of a history book, would go down to Willits to fetch some women for a dance out on the tennis court. So, you know, people would come up, they'd have parties on the tennis court, they'd play tennis. It was a big piece of recreation. It was a big reason why people would stay at that camp. There were 60 workers at that camp and not a single bathhouse. So can you imagine 60 lumbermen out working in the forest and then coming back at the end of the day? So what they would do is they would go down, just down the hill to Clare Mill, and evidently they would bathe under this water tank, which still exists today. So there was no bathhouse there at Crowley. So I can't imagine what that smelled like some days. There was a very famous cookhouse. This is the remnants of the cookhouse from what I can tell. You can't tell in the picture, but there's a wall that's in there that's collapsed, and that was kind of the giveaway that it was the cookhouse. The rest of the cabins would not have been separated space. They would have been literally bunkhouses. They were just open and they had cots in them. But the cookhouse would have to have separated areas for the kitchen and the rest of it. So this is the remnants of it. The written documentation that I could find about Crowley talks about how good the cooks were at Crowley, and that there were always pies, there was always good meat, there was always good food to be had there. And you had to keep these lumbermen happy. They were consuming between 6,000 and 9,000 calories a day. So wouldn't you like to be able to do that? It's like, oh darn, I think I'll go have an entire pie for dessert because I can have 9,000 calories a day. But when you think about it, they were hand bucking trees, they were limbing trees, they were hauling and hooking them up so they could be skidded down hills. They were working all day long. So the camp operated into the 40s until the lumber ran out that way and they closed up. Also, advent of the automobile, trucking industry, it was easier for workers to start living somewhere more civilized, say, in town. So this is what Crowley looked like then with the cabins and the rails that ran through it. And this is what Crowley looks like now. So with the railroad just running straight through there. It's really beautiful out there. The last time that the area was logged was in 1978. And it's kind of a funny story. My coworker Nikki and I were talking about this just the other day, and I was trying to find, I was looking through all the reports. When did they last log it? I know that it was the last time that they brought logs into town on the train. I was a little boy. The house that I'm living in is kind of the last crossing before the train heads out of town. And I remember it was a big deal. It was in the newspaper. And I said, Nikki, I think it was 1976. And so we dug around and Nikki found it that it was 1978 that they actually brought the last logs into town. So those came in by train out of this region. There are still remnants of the cabins out there. So this is one of the other residential cabins. So those remnants are still out there. There are still orchards out there. So this was from a hike 2 years ago. I got to pick an apple off the tree and eat it. It was delicious, but you know, they grew a lot of their food out that way. Crowley is still out there along the Skunk Line. The train still runs out to Crowley. It's here down at the bottom as a star on the map. It's a lovely ride if you haven't done that yet. And Crowley, as I was mentioning, is located in the middle of the Noyo River Redwoods. And that's all that green shaded area. The light green shaded area is all what we call the Noyo River Redwoods. Mendocino Land Trust acquired the land. We own that land in fee, meaning we are the owners. The 426 acres, we got that from Save the Redwoods League with a grant, a $4 million grant. And the skunk train still has the right of way all through that property there. There's the dotted line that runs back and forth. That's all the way up the mountain. It's very steep in there. So we're working on some hiking trails through the area. Those are the red lines that you see over on the right side. We're also working to manage the forest a little bit. So that forest was heavily logged. And what happens, kind of like cutting a lawn, you cut that down and then it comes back, which is great. And, you know, especially when you saw that very first picture that I showed you about resource extraction, where it was just clear cut and there was nothing left. The forest does recover. It's slow, but it does do that. But it comes back very, very thick and very, very dense. So we've done a couple of things under Nikki's direction, actually, she's one of our team members, put in what are called shaded fuel breaks. And this is a picture where you can see right down a corridor here of the forest. And these shaded fuel breaks are for fire defense. They help if there was a fire, this gives a break so that there's not just fuel, there's not just continuous fuel for it to burn. And it gives firefighters a place to have some defensible space. We've also done some selective thinning so that the trees aren't as competitive with each other. If you leave them all alone, they're all going to compete for the water and they may all die. So what we do is we select a few of them and they let more of them mature so that we can get a forest that's managed to what's called late cirral stage. And that's what the forest was called, or what you would call a forest that's not logged, late cirral. It's going to take some time and patience to get back there, but you know, we're on our way. There's been other restoration work out in the area, and it's not all ours, but I thought this was important to spotlight. It's been in the news lately. There's a series of culverts along the stream, and this is one of them. And you can see there's a giant drop right there out of the culvert and into the river. And the skunk train partnered with Trout Unlimited. And what they did was they replaced that culvert with something that was much more accessible to the fish so that the fish can get back up there and through there. And I mean, it just looks a whole lot nicer. So I see people nodding and smiling. So it's a nice look. So there's nice partnerships and everything's working towards recovery out that way. So a couple of other interesting points about Crowley and that part of the world. When Mendocino Land Trust took the land, there was an archaeology report. And the archaeologists were fascinated by the curved trestle. Now, this wasn't in Crowley, but if you went up the tracks towards Willits, there was this giant curved trestle. And there's a lot of interesting things in this picture. So the first thing you can see, oh, I'm being told that my slides are lagging just a second, so I'll try to let those catch up. Thank you, Heidi, for the feedback. So there's this giant S-shaped trestle a little bit up the tracks from Crowley, and there's some really interesting things to see here. You can see that the engines are doubled, and I had somebody tell me once, I said, no, those engines aren't doubled. There's an engine in the front and there's an oil car. And I said, well, that train's gonna have a problem because that oil car's got a smoke flume coming out of it over here. So I'm pretty sure that's an engine there. Couple of other interesting things. The California Western only owned 2 passenger cars, and I count either 5 or 6, depending on how you look at this picture. So I'm guessing this was a railroad excursion that they borrowed some cars from the Northwestern Pacific, ran them out to Fort Bragg and back. So somebody was having a party train of some sort. There's also this hose coming across right here and on there. That's for fire defense. It gets dry and hot, and that trestle was all built out of wood. One spark and that whole trestle would go up, and then they wouldn't have any way to repair it very quickly or get lumber out. And then one of the most fascinating things about this picture, everything seems to be death-defying in this era. If you look over here at the left side of the train, there's a person hanging off. He's here in white, and I don't know if I'm that adventurous to hang off the side of a train while it's going over a trestle that is many stories above the redwood floor. So you never know who you're going to get on your party train, but I'm not sure that that person's the person you want to latch onto right there. So the trestle no longer exists. The railroad filled that in with what's called high fill. And what they would do is they would back trains out over the trestle. And here we see a work train coming out over the trestle with all of these cars filled with rock and dirt. And what they would do is then they would then dump that over the side until it all got filled up underneath the trestle. Here is a kind of one of the last photographs, at least the last one I could find. And the trestle still exists over there on the right, and they've sent this excursion train over there. And then the new tracks that they laid on the high fill area are over there on the left. And these are probably early 70s, best I can tell. And the reason I can tell that is because these are engines that were brought in. Engine 45 was brought in the 60s, and engine 46 was brought in, I think, late 60s, early 70s. So by the time they fixed up the second engine, ran it on an excursion train, it had to be early 70s. So they still used the trestle for that, but that's the last picture I can find of a train on that trestle before they took that out. So that's kind of where we leave the California Western Railroad. So we're going to take off, unless I don't see Heidi flapping around and sending me any questions at this point yet. But I would gladly take any. I can pause here for a second to see if I get anything. I'm not seeing anything.
Larry, we do have some questions that are specific to what we've been talking about. You ready for those? Great, I would love that. Okay, Jill asks, why is it called the skunk train? That's great. And I think Robert Pinoli is on the call, and I think one of the Hart brothers is also here, so I hope I get this right. So they call it the skunk train because of the little motor cars that they have that run on the railroad. And those are gasoline powered. So the first passenger trains, had the steam engines, they pulled them up the hill, but they were finding that not to be profitable. So they got some motor cars that were gas and diesel powered. And what would happen is the exhaust, if you've ever been out in the woods, the exhaust carries up and down the river. And what would happen is they'd run these trains, up the hill, and the exhaust would carry up the river before the train could get there. So much like a skunk, you could smell it before you could see it. So that's why they called it the skunk train. That's great. We also have a question if the name Crowley for the camp might have any relation to Crowley Marine, a maritime company in San Francisco Bay Area that goes back to the gold rush. It very well may, actually. That's a great question. Crowley or Crowley, depending how you say it, has a couple of associations with maritime, also logging all across the country. They came from France and started logging in the northeast of the country, and there are Crowleys and Crowleys and camps all the way across the country. There are shipping companies with the same name, and I suspect that they have the same origins. Great. We also have a rather personal question. Sarah N wanted to know your grandmother's name. Who wants to know? Now I'm just curious who wants to know. Sarah N is what I wrote down. All right. Well, Sarah, my grandmother was Dolores Shafsky. She was married to Miro Shafsky. And I also had Mabel and Dana were my great grandmothers. So Mabel Royster was my great grandmother on my grandmother's side. Okay. I think that a multi-generational who knows who. Yeah, so hopefully that calls. Yeah, reach out to me. I have contact information at the end. I always love connecting with people on that. I have one more question for you about Crowley or Crowley. How many years did that timber camp operate, if you know or can estimate? So they came in, the best I can tell is late teens, and then they were out by the early 40s. So, 15 years, 20 years, somewhere in there, which is long lived for a lumber camp. Yeah, must have been a whole lot of trees. That's a whole lot of trees to get out of there, yes. We have a question Erica just put in. She wants to know if Crowley is accessible for hiking now. So the only way to get out there is by train. So you can get out there by train. We don't have the hiking trails open to the public yet. We're working on that. But you can get out there and see the area by train, but you can't get out and hike the trails just yet. And trust me, we've tried getting out there, Nikki and I. Thanks, Larry. I think that's all we got for questions right now. That's great. Yeah, no, Nikki and I, it's fun. It's quite an adventure if you aren't taking the train out there. The train is the easiest way to get out there, but you can four-wheel drive it if you have to, and you have all the keys and access, which we do. But Nikki and I famously got the truck stuck in the mud out there. We thought we were going to be hiking back in at one point. So that's it's a long ways out. I don't recommend it. So
So the next place we're going to talk about is on the Caspar, Southfork, and Eastern Railroad. And this is my favorite history stuff to study. I used to just be fascinated that there was this entire rail network that existed out of Caspar, California. And just for those that aren't in the area, if my East Coast folks are still hanging on, it's very late back there. We've moved from the east over at Crowley. I've got a map up there at the top of the slide. We've gone a little further west, and we're going to talk about an area called Bunker Gulch. And that is a railroad that connected to Caspar, which is just a little town south of Fort Bragg. Used to be a whole city down there, and now it's really just kind of a sleepy little hamlet at this point. And although I love Caspar, that is not a slam on Caspar. I think Caspar's amazing. So there are lots of great people in an amazing community center down there. But we're going to talk about the Caspar, Southfork, and Eastern. That was the railroad that fed the Caspar Mill. This is a historical picture of the Caspar Mill that sat down in Caspar Creek. That mill that is pictured there sat right down below the bridge if you're heading down Highway 1 or up Highway 1. On the west side of the bridge, down in that valley is where that mill sat. You would never know it now. It's completely overgrown with trees, but there was an entire log pond down there and a mill infrastructure, buildings that supported it. It operated from the late 1800s all the way up till about 1955 is when they actually took the mill down. And actually they set it on fire and just burned it as kind of a thing. Sometimes I laugh about that because we're way more sensitive now. If Georgia Pacific had thought they could get off that easy and just light it and torch it and burn it, then they would have been a lot happier, I'm sure. But we're doing a lot more better work with remediation on the environment now. So we're more rails here. So this is a close-up of the Caspar, Southfork, and Eastern Railroad. So they based out of Caspar, which is in the very center left side of the map there, and they logged Jug Handle Creek. And Jug Handle Creek didn't go very far, and it didn't get them very long for a supply of lumber. So they moved a little bit north. So they moved up to Hare Creek, which is not any great body of water. It's a creek. It's lovely, especially in the late fall. It's a beautiful place to go hiking. But they went up there and they started logging Hare Creek. And so they kept going up Hare Creek as far as they could, and then they ran out of lumber again. And they weren't sure what they were going to do. It was, looking like the Caspar Mill might go bankrupt. But there was a little bit of a, I don't want to call it a swindle, but I'm going to call it a deal. So they wanted this lumberland over here. And what happened was there was a store down in Caspar. That's where all of the lumbermen and their families would shop. And they weren't paid with a regular paycheck. So every lumberman got paid with what was called a time draft. And Union Lumber Company did it, so did Caspar. Evidently, it was very common practice. But Caspar got smart. They started honoring the Union Lumber Company time drafts. So Caspar store, the lumbermen would go down to the Caspar store. They thought the prices were better, and they would spend their paychecks at the Caspar store. And normally what the Caspar Lumber Company would do would take those time drafts, you'd bring them to the corporate office and exchange them for cash. But Caspar saved them, and they saved them for a long time, and they kept saving them. And when they knew that the Union Lumber Company had zero cash, they called the note. And the lumber company couldn't do anything but to give them the land over on the South Fork of the Noyo River. So it wasn't really a swindle. They got it fair and square. They did buy the land, but Union Lumber Company was a bit over a barrel to give up that land because that was their timber inventory that they were going to work. So instead, Caspar got it. So now they've got this land, but what you can't see on the map is that it's over a big hill. And their railroad is all down in the Gulch. It's down there in Hare Creek where we were before. So the railroad's all down here and the lumber's all over here. So what are they going to do? Well, the best thing they could think to do was do what's right there in the center. They bored a tunnel right through the mountain, right under what is now Highway 20. So they came right up Bunker Gulch. They laid tracks straight up the middle of a creek and went through the mountain and over into the Noyo River watershed. So they weren't particularly gentle about how they did that. So when they were building the tunnel, they just carved right into the mountain there. And one of the things we talk about, with salmon and salmon restoration is that, silt is what keeps them away. And I can't imagine how much silt this caused going down into Hare Creek at the time. So, but this is what they did to build the tunnel. And this is what the tunnel looked like when they were done. They logged that whole area out. If you look up the hills there, almost nary a tree on it on that property right there. They just cut all the trees and they hauled them off to the mill. The engine that's coming down there through the tunnel is named Hercules. He's why did I just lose it? He's a geared engine. They always called him a he instead of a she, but very low geared engine. It's kind of like having a 4-wheel drive on your truck. It's kind of like the 4-wheel drive train. It was able to pull long and low on those kinds of things. So this is one more picture. This is how they laid the track up Bunker Gulch. And that is a picture of Bunker Gulch. You can see all the trees downed up on the hillside there. And that really, they just laid that railroad line straight up the middle of the gulch. So the mill slowed down. They kept logging. They logged all of that Noyo area all the way up to Camp 20 along Highway 20, up through the 50s. The mill slowed down. They had an inventory of logs. There were a couple of lumber strikes. And between 1950 and 1955, they shut the mill down. The branch lines that we saw up there, that whole spidered network, got taken up earlier than that. They only had the main line left, which ran through the mountain and out to Camp 20, which is a stop out there on Highway 20 for all the locals. This engine that you see pictured here used to sit out there, but got vandalized quite a bit. People would come spray paint it, or they'd try to take pieces off of it or what have you. But it was the last engine, that was the last train that ran on the railroad out there to what they thought was going to be a museum. Thankfully, they rescued this. If you go over to Laurel Deli, this is the train that sits in the middle of Laurel Deli at this point. It's a really cute engine. I love this, all the little things that festoon the engine here right by the drive wheels. They've got these little pressure ball valves, are very cute. They kept the bell shiny on that engine, even though that engine was working and it was working hard all the time. They did convert this to oil. This is a pretty early picture of the engine out on the railroad. They converted it to burn oil, but at the time you can see back there in the back of the cab, they've got wood stacked up to burn. So, but that's a very cool engine. But yeah, go visit Daisy over at the Laurel Deli and you can take a look at her. So there was a lasting effect on the redwoods there. That is the former right-of-way of the railroad down there in Bunker Gulch. The roads are there. The creek has been filled in. But there's been a lot of restoration work. So Mendocino Land Trust has worked with California Conservation Corps and state forests to do road decommissioning. And so what they do is they bring in some of this big equipment and they rough up the road. And I gotta tell you, it looks like ballet. I was afraid of putting video. I have some video of the operator working this loader, but it looks like ballet between that and the bulldozer that they used, where they would pull things up and then reshape the way the mountainside was before they put the railroad in. Really just amazing work. But here's a second picture. You can see how they've sloped the land so that the water can run off, and it's a little bit more natural up that way. So this is what it was, and that's what they were working with to get back. There are still some pieces of this railroad out there. So this trestle, which, this is the second time I've shown the picture, which by the way is a glass plate from UC Berkeley. It was very cool to find that. So this trestle, I believe, now looks like this. So it's still there, but it's gotten grown over and the creek has kind of found its way around it. So there are still parts of the railroad out there. Mendocino Land Trust back in 2019 at the end, actually on one of our hosts' birthday in December, took, I believe it was a very weird number, 980 something, like 981. It wasn't quite 1,000 little redwood tree seedlings, and we took them out to Bunker Gulch and Hare Creek, and we planted all 981 of those trees. And I am very happy to report that I went back out there just last week and I could find our trees and they are doing well. So we've got restoration on its way for Bunker Gulch with new trees coming. Some other work that's happened out there, partnering with the CCC, adding what's called large woody debris into the stream. And what that does is it creates ponds and pools so that salmon have some habitat there on the creek. And just so you don't think the entire area is devastated, this is an aerial from the last satellite. Bunker Gulch is kind of running right up the center, up towards the right. You can see the marker that says Bunker Gulch down here. That's right where we took that picture holding all those trees. But the forest has come back. You can see that it's green. It is really beautiful to take a walk down that way. So coming back to the rails, just a few kind of fun facts about the Caspar, Southfork, and Eastern Railroad, which had beautiful machines. They had two of these machines called mallets. These were Anatole Mallet, developed the technology, and what it did was it kind of made it more fuel efficient to have two engines under one boiler. And so what would happen is the steam would be under high pressure and feed this engine here in the middle of the engine and drive the wheels. But then instead of being discharged through the smokestack, would come back and then be recycled and come through this engine up here. So where California Western had to put two engines to work a hill, both of these engines could do it on their own because there were two engines under one boiler. So it was kind of a fascinating machine. They're really fun to watch because they're articulated and they bend in the middle. So it's a very cool kind of thing to watch coming around a corner. Some other interesting things out there on the Caspar Railroad, they had incredibly high trussels, especially coming out of the tunnel and going down into the Noyo River watershed. That's where these two curved trussels are. This one over on the left that's got the men standing on the top of it, and then the one at the top right with the work train. Both of those trussels were down in the Noyo River watershed. The other tall trussel here, which is just mind-boggling how tall it was and how much weight it must carry, was over Jug Handle Creek. That's the trussel that they had to lay out to get from Caspar and Jug Handle Creek up and over to the Hare Creek watershed. You always get to tell fun things in railroad pictures. So, you know, and you get good or better at seeing some of these things. So, you know, one of the interesting things on that big picture on the left is that they stopped the train at all where they stopped it because they are coming up grade. So they're going to have to get that engine moving again with all of its load because there's something to do with momentum. And, you know, if the train, somebody said, oh, how can you tell? And I said, well, you know, if the train's moving, they're in trouble because the engineer is standing out here over on the left. So that's probably not a good deal. And the fireman's out there on the pilot. A couple of other interesting things, other than the fact that they are doing this death-defying stance out over the top of the trestle, because there is no walkway out there. They didn't get to walk around the engine and onto the front. What they did was they crawled over the top of that engine to pose for this picture. The two guys over on the right are the brakemen, and they didn't have air brakes. And I think I mentioned on the previous slide, I didn't say anything about it. Those two big mallet engines had air brakes. But those air brakes only worked in the engine. So modern trains have brakes all throughout the train. So that's how those trains would stop. These trains didn't have any brakes at all. What you did was you slowed down and you hoped to stop in the right place. They had some brakes that you were, you know, contact brakes, much like your bicycle might have. But can you imagine, you know, the multi-ton engine and we're gonna put a little bit of metal against metal and see if it stops. It's kind of a hard deal. But what these two guys on the right have are some keys in their hands. And what they would do is they would start out on the back of the train when they were at the bottom of the hill. And as they came up to the top of the hill, as they just got up to the top of the hill, what they would do is they would run across the top of all of the log cars and they would reach down between, and there was a handbrake in there. And they would reach down while the train is moving, crank the handbrake a little bit, and then get back up, jump the car, and then go up to the next one and do the next one, all while the train was still moving. So that would slow the train down enough so that when they got to the downhill side, the train wouldn't run out of control and down around a curve. And then when they were coming into the station, they would crank it down even more. So they would run back and forth across the top of the train, reach down there between the cars, and crank the brakes. The other interesting thing in this is you can see the coupling system of the Caspar Railroad, and it's just this big pin that's sticking out in front of the engine. So modern day couplers, and I'm going to try and show this on the camera if you can see me, kind of fit together like a hook. So they hook together, and then if there's pressure, it keeps them together. The Caspar Railroad ran on lynch pins. So they would put the two cars together, put a pin in there, and hope that the pin didn't break by the time they got back to the station. So I see somebody in chat, and I'll answer the questions more later, but there's no remnants left anymore of that tall trestle. It used to be out Road 350, but they took that down at one point. So one more fun thing at the Caspar Mill, this is the log chute, and the trains used to come across the top there of the bluff, and they would stop the log cars, and there was this giant kind of crane boom thing. They would push the logs off, and then the log would take a very nice ride down this hill and then splash into the log pond and make a huge plume of water. People would come from miles around to see this thing happen here at the Caspar Mill. So that was that. That is my presentation for the night. So that was kind of, our brief introduction, Rails and Redwoods. Hopefully you got the happy endings in there for each of the railroads that we have been doing some restoration. The forests are getting restored. I want to thank a couple of people, Amy for being our MC, Heidi who is taking questions at this point. Everybody on the MLT team is pretty spectacular, including our board. They're a very happy, wonderful set of people. Kevin Bunker over at the Fort Bragg Historical Society. I don't know if you're on the Zoom call tonight, but he helped me out with some of the research tonight. And you can see I have a litany of research there. One of them is a text. I'm going to grab it from the 1890s, the Encyclopedia of Mendocino County. If you are seeing me, this is a very old book that has been left with the house here and had lots of interesting information. So Amy, I think you had more questions, or Heidi?
I do. I'm gonna read off this round. So Jill wanted to know kind of early on when you were showing some of those pictures that were essentially clear cuts, what were these entire forests of lumber turned into? Where did that wood go and what did we make with it?
Sure. Well, lots of the lumber. So you're looking at some of it in my background here. I kind of feel guilty about that this is probably virgin redwood used as paneling in this room at one point. But it's been this way since I grew up. It's been here for many decades. It went to build houses. Much of it, especially anytime after 1906, almost all of it went to San Francisco to rebuild San Francisco and the Bay Area. Down in Albion, they made a lot of railroad ties. So that's where that lumber went when you see some of that clear cut. But most of it went to San Francisco to fuel the rebuilding after the earthquake.
Okay. All right, we had a question from Sadie who would like to know, do you know how they got Daisy into the Laurel Deli?
That's an awesome question. They brought Daisy by truck out of Camp 20. They blocked off Highway 20. It was too wide to take. There are some pictures of it in the Advocate News archives. I've not dug them up lately, but I know Sadie, and we could go to the library and look when we're out of pandemic. But they did it before they closed the building in. They lowered the engine in there and then they built it around her.
Cool.
Yeah.
This is sort of a related question from Tom about all the railroad equipment in general. Did it come to Caspar via ship? How did these engines get here?
Yeah, no, actually, that's a fascinating question. And if I had way more time, I've already been talking for the better part of an hour. I could spend, many hours on the Caspar Railroad. They brought all of those engines by ship from San Francisco in pieces. And then much like you saw those people being dragged up from the steam schooner and the lumber, they would haul each piece from the steam schooner up to the mill site, and then they would rebuild the engine on site. Every wheel, every rod, every piston, the boiler, the cab, it all comes apart, and then they take it apart, put it on the ship, and then bring it up here. There is a very famous story about engine number 3 for the Caspar Railroad, where they dropped it and then they ended up dragging it out, the boiler, and then up onto the shore, and then they would wait for high tide, so they could get wood underneath it, and then, you know, kind of try to float it as far as they could. And they had to drag it up off the beach and clean it. So it had an accident before it even hit the tracks.
Very exciting. The last question that I saw in the chat was, and I think Amy answered it in the chat, but can this presentation be viewed again later? And the answer is yes, we are recording. And I think Amy will find a way to share the presentation maybe on our website and maybe also through social media. So yeah, we'll make sure that if you want to share this with friends or watch it again, it'll be available.
Oh, that's awesome.
Oh, I see one more question just popped up from Jill. Were there any women in the logging camps as cooks or wives or anything?
So it depended. So it depended on which camp you were in. So Crowley camp, there were no families. They were different than the other logging camps. Other logging camps if lumbermen had families, the whole family could live out in the lumber camp. Camp 1 along the Caspar Railroad, which is out Road 350 and by the egg taking station, which is a great day use place, especially in pandemic. Go get out there, get some fresh air. It's beautiful. That was families would live there, or there were singles, you know, there was all sorts of very mixed. And also, as far as, you know, powerful women in the lumber industry, the Caspar Mill and Lumber Company, the second president was a woman, Abby Krebs, and she ran that very, very well. She was very, very successful, very well respected in the lumber industry across the United States, actually, used as a model for running a good business right here on the coast.
No, and now your answers are leading to more questions.
Great.
A question about what is the egg taking station?
Oh, okay, sorry. Egg taking station, or also called the egg collecting station, is out Road 350. And that's, if you go on the map or if you contact me later, I will tell you how to get there. But you go out Highway 20 and then down Road 350, which is the old Caspar Railroad grade. And there was a salmon ladder, and they would grab the eggs from the salmon and put them in a hatchery. So hopefully that answers the question.
All right, I think that might be it.
That's awesome. I am thrilled that everyone came tonight.
We got one more.
Oh, great.
Sorry, I'm on a delay here.
That's great.
I got a direct message, a question about if there'll be any connection with the Great Redwoods Trail from Marin to Eureka. I guess the question is, could it one day come up here as well?
I'm not sure on that one. That's a great question. Something to think about. Yeah, that Great Redwood Trail sounds pretty cool.
I'd just like to say, can everyone give Larry a round of applause here on mute, so you might just see it, but thank you. That was a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you all for being here. I really had a good time.
All right, and stay tuned. Please, if you don't already subscribe to the newsletter, send me an email, and we will keep you apprised of future conservation conversations. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.